Why would Russia steal a Malaysian airliner? It's the first question people always ask me whenever I tell them about my theory about the spoof attack on MH370. It just doesn't make sense to people. I remember vividly the first time I talked about my theory on CNN back in 2015 on the year anniversary of the disappearance. Richard Quest, who was somebody who covered it frequently with me on CNN, was absolutely flabbergasted. He said, why would they do this? What's the motive? And it seemed inconceivable to him. It seems inconceivable to a lot of people. To address that question, we have to try to understand what the world looked like from Putin's perspective in early 2014. What was happening in the world? What were the stakes for him? What did he need to accomplish? To try to understand that, I, in the past, have turned to a friend and really a colleague I respect enormously, Melik Kaylan, who is a Turkish-born, UK-raised journalist who is so knowledgeable about foreign affairs that he has really helped me over the years to understand this issue. And I think he will help listeners and viewers of this podcast really understand the context in which it happened. He is a man of incredible knowledge and sagacity. So in today's episode, episode 3 of season 2 of Deep Dive MH370, we turn to Melik Kaylan, who I'm going to interview right now. Before I get started with Melik, I just want to say to people who might be watching this podcast for the first time who I am. My name is Jeff Wise. I'm a science writer and aviation journalist. Over the years, I have flown a pretty significant number of airplanes. I've had my pilot's license since 2002. I've written a book called The Taking of MH370. You might know me from the Netflix documentary MH370, The Plane That Disappeared. But right now, without any further ado, let's get into this interview with Melik Kaylan. Melik, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. Good to see you.
I want to talk a little bit about your background because I think your expertise really is important. And you've been covering this part of the world for decades now. Could you tell us a little bit about your study? Now, you are Turkish, but you studied in England. Is that right?
Yeah, so I was born in Istanbul, but I started a boarding school in the UK at the age of about 9, and really just grew up in the UK.
Okay.
Became a bit of a Brit in a way. But then in later years, went back to the zones where I actually could speak some languages also. And that's why I was useful, I guess. To
What
cover.
languages do you speak?
Oh, gosh. English, French, German, Italian, Arabic, Turkish,
Oh, my God.
and some Central Asian languages. I'm one of those people who picks up and forgets languages quite quickly.
Okay. Okay.
A weird facility.
And so I wanted to talk to you today. One of the questions that people always ask me is, what would the motivation potentially for Russia be if it got involved in MH370? We know it was involved in MH17 for sure. It was certainly a kind of a transitional time. A lot was happening in 2014. And so I wanted to talk to you about where Russia had come from that it was behaving the way that it did at that time. You focus on many parts of the world, but and I want to talk about that as well. But you have continued to cover Russia, and recently, in fact, just a few days ago, as we're talking now in early June, you just had a piece in Forbes where I thought you made some really interesting points about the Russia-Ukraine war, which I argue is the central conflict in this whole issue. What was your piece about?
Well, let me give you some background about my expertise, and that would put the Forbes column in perspective.
Okay.
I've covered the Rossosphere a lot, beginning with even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of Georgia. The
Hmm.
Russian invasion of Georgia began in 2008. I was already covering Georgia in 2004. And I've written two books about Russia and China and the new Cold War in like 2014, 2016.
We'll
And
put links to those in the show notes.
okay. And aside from the Middle East, which I've covered a lot, I've also done the Far East, I've done the Russosphere. I did a documentary on ISIS with my friend Sebastian Junger, the war journalist,
Hmm.
uh, in 2016. Um, and I spent a lot of time on the borders, Syrian border, Iraqi border, in and out, and became a bit of a border specialist. Azerbaijan, Iran border. I even sneaked into Burma from Thailand. And
That's very interesting to me, Melik, because border areas in conflicts require a lot of savvy, and that means understanding the cultures, understanding, having empathy for the people who might be very young soldiers who might be trigger happy. You have to understand how to comport yourself and understand the meaning of their signals and gestures.
yeah, exactly. That's something I try to explain to people. It's possibly helped by or might explain why I pick up languages very quickly. But I remember before going to the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, I live in New York. I hung out with a lot of Pakistani taxi drivers. I would go to their cafes and things. Just knowing how to befriend people and sense if they're hostile or if the situation is getting very tense.
Well, this is why I wanted to talk to you about this, because your savvy, your empathy, your putting together puzzle pieces, your ability to put yourself into a cultural context that is not your native context,
Yeah,
but that you can understand the intricacies, and you spend time in a part of the world where cultural histories are intertwined, conflict, intermarriage, trade going back thousands of years can lead to a very complex tapestry.
good for you.
Uh,
Exactly.
and so that's what we're trying to get out today, is to try to understand, how does somebody else looks at the world very different from how I, an American, who has grown up in a monoculture of sorts, who
Mm,
thinks that everybody just wants to go to high school and be the prom king or a cheerleader.
yeah,
The world is actually full of a multitude of viewpoints and traditions and beliefs and motives that might not be so apparent to many of us.
yeah. I mean, I think we tend to be in the U.S. historically illiterate. Anyway,
Mm.
um, and the more diverse we get, we become more culturally informed. But as I always say, all this diversity stuff just makes us ignorant in many languages and many cultures, because it's not that you don't get the height of a country's culture or history um, in the U.S. Um,
There's a kind of mindset in this country and elsewhere that all of what we're talking about is very squishy and very suitable for academics sitting around drinking tea, but it's not important. What's important is math and engineering, and all of this other stuff is just very squishy.
yeah,
However, if you live in a world where you have to interact with other people, some of these people might be hostile, some of these people might attack you or not attack you. It actually behooves you to be able to understand other people, so that you might not be surprised when they take actions that affect you dramatically. You and I share that value,
mm,
that we want to promote democracy and free markets, not unregulated free markets, but
right.
essentially the idea of capitalism,
Sure.
and economic choice. And it's important to understand, in the context of what we're talking about today, that this is a value that is not universally held, that is actually under attack by people who feel differently, which is what we're going to deal with in our conversation. Uh,
So let's address that.
let's
Um,
address that. Yeah.
yeah. So back in the 2000s, I started to go a lot to Eastern Europe and what used to be, I guess, called the Iron Curtain countries. And I took a particular interest in Georgia, Tbilisi, Georgia, and the Caucasus um, roundabout Georgia, which is Azerbaijan, Iran, Armenia, and so on. And I was there to write a dispatch when George W. Bush visited and gave a speech there. And the president of the time was a young president of Georgia, in his 30s still, who had been the inspiration for the color revolutions, both in his country, in Ukraine, and in other places, the democracy movements that sort of overthrew a lot of the corrupt post-Soviet tottering regimes. And what happened, the cycle of history went that the involvement by the US in Iraq and Afghanistan allowed Russia and China back into the sort of domination game in the rest of the world, over the rest of the world. And the outcome was that those color revolutions were largely erased or overthrown by a new wave of Russian influence with post-Soviet authoritarian politicians. And
Can you give
often,
us a time frame about when the color revolutions took place, and then when this totalitarian backlash against those pro-democracy movements took place?
yeah. So, for example, in the case of Tbilisi, of Georgia, it would have the color revolutions and the overthrows would have been 2002, 3, 4, entering democracy, color revolution winning, uh, invasion of Georgia 2008 by Putin. At that point, the US was up to its neck in Afghanistan and Iraq and couldn't do anything about it. Um, then it went on until 2012, when the very pro-Western Georgian president, who had also been educated partly in the US in his young years, he was still pretty young when he was president, um, was beaten in an election. So 2012, 2013 was beaten in an election where a lot of the techniques and tricks later used in other countries, including in the US in 2016, were first unfurled by a very powerful KGB influence over Georgia, over a little country like Georgia. And what happened is that the pro-American president lost. 2013, his gradually had to leave office within the next year or so. And somebody came in the opposition who was extremely rich, who was an oligarch, a guy called Bidzina Ivanishvili, who was very quietly pro-Russian. But his attitude was that he was going to be neutral. He wasn't going to provoke Putin. Back in 2008, under the pro-American president Saakashvili, the Russians had invaded Georgia, and the excuse was that Saakashvili, the pro-Russian president, the anti-Russian president, was too pro-American, too provocatively pro-American. So that was the first sign of Russia taking back, under Putin, um, in a comprehensive way, the ex-colonies. And that was the beginning of the end of the color revolutions effects. You know, they had happened during the 2000s and mid to late 2000s even. But in the end, the pro-Russian movements began to overwhelm them. After 2010, the US was too busy. Um, the war on terror had taken its toll with US stamina, and the Russians began to come back. And then you saw they moved on from Georgia to Ukraine. You saw the invasion of Crimea, the invasion of eastern
Well,
Ukraine.
that happened after um, the Maidan, and I want to talk to you about the Maidan. But before that, I want to put a pin in where we are right now, and I want to pull the lens back and
Mm.
look at Russia's perspective, and especially Putin's perspective on the world order, how the world looks from Putin's eyeballs. And he grew up in what was then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg.
Right.
The city at the time was still reeling from this incredibly long and devastating siege that Hitler's armies had placed it under, a real hamburger grinder of a siege. He one of his siblings, I believe, died. But Putin grew up in a true believer in the Soviet Empire, which, if I'm unless I'm mistaken, was a continuation of the Russian Empire in
Mm.
essence. In this idea, is that something you'd agree with?
Yeah, absolutely. People who don't want to accept that Russia is imperialist in the way that the Soviets were imperialist like to remind me that Stalin was Georgian after all. But that's just not good enough. I mean, empires become multi ethnic because they impose their force on lots of different ethnicities. And as with the Roman Empire, as with the Ottoman Empire, what often happens is that different ethnicities take over the empire at various times, but the empire is still the empire. What the Soviets did allow was greater participation at the very top from different nationalities. Um, what the Russian Empire, revived Russian Empire under Putin, it doesn't allow that because it appeals a lot to the sort of Mother Russia, glorious Russia, Orthodox Russia, and its mission, the anti-Western, anti-decadence missionary zeal. It relies on a lot of that kind of messaging to fire up its imperial zeal. Um, Putin has never believed in any of that. He just believes in the empire, and
Okay.
he will utilize whatever ideology is necessary.
If you look at the very biggest sweep of history, you have medieval kingdoms that grew in under Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, gradually bigger and bigger, became the Russian Empire, collapsed in 1917, was recongregated, reassembled by the Soviets, then fell apart again with places like Estonia and Lithuania and Kazakhstan and all these various parts becoming independent countries. You saw places like Chechnya, which were part of Russia proper, but tried to, it had a very significant rebellion to try to peel away. So you have this continuous pattern, not continuous, but a repeated pattern of conglomeration followed by collapse and then reassembly.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But to the true, to those, to the make Russia great again uh, contingent, the
Yeah.
mission is always to go for that maximal, like Roman Empire, as you say, like in bringing these other ethnicities under your ethnicity. America wants to make everybody a democracy. So there's that kind of evangelical democracy spreading. And we also kind of want to make everyone American. We want everyone to eat hamburgers and watch NFL. I would like to think that our best vision of the West in this inclusive, embracive way that is uh, multipolar and dynamic will embrace multitudes. Russia is not like that. It's a very different kind of global ambition.
Yeah, let me tell you a story. When I covered the 2008 invasion of Georgia by Putin, um, one of the things that happened is that I introduced the pro-American president of Georgia to the Wall Street Journal editorial board. Anyway, he became something of a friend of mine. He told me a story. I spent some time with him. He told me a story of how often he would be at sort of gatherings in Georgia, within his own country. People would start drinking. There'd be a few Russians there. And all of a sudden, they'd be singing Russian nostalgic songs. And they'd all get drunk and hug each other and start singing songs that were essentially, about great Russia and Mother Russia. And Saakashvili, the Georgian president, said to me, I just don't understand why we do that, why people, my fellow Georgians, do that to appease the Russians amongst them, when Great Mother Russia basically means Georgia as a colony. So that's what the Russian attitude is towards its colonies. It's about about instilling in those populations what a kind of emotional kind of brotherhood or fraternity or family they belong to by buying into the whole Russian Empire nostalgia. And of course, you can practice your religion or this or that, but you just have to be like emotionally on our side and so on. So in a and if you don't buy into that, you'll get invaded, essentially. So yes, it's great, it's drunken, it's pally up to a point.
Right.
But the minute you say to yourself, no, I am Kazakhstan or I am a Tatar, and my national and cultural independence and history and trajectory of my people has been hijacked by the Russians. This must stop. Let us return to self-determination, return to our history. I visit Uzbekistan on and off, and what I found out there is that they'd like to, return to their own medieval roots of understanding who they are. But all of those documents have been taken away by the Russians. All those things have been written in Russian. It's a little bit like not being able to go back to all the documents of the founding fathers and figuring out what they intended. The Uzbeks don't have a continuity of consciousness about
So
who
is
they.
this Russian maximalism founded primarily on the history of conquest, the extent to which Russia has been able to Russianize countries like Central Asia, the Balkans, um, the Baltics, and does that imply that places that have not historically been Russianized are safe? That Russia will maybe they'll embrace, maybe they'll try to invade Finland, but they won't invade Sweden.
I mean, I think uh, that's ultimately a question of what is logistically possible
Okay.
to defend by Russia should they invade any of those places. Um, I think it's also a sort of deep-rooted sense of what belongs to them, what is neutral, and what is beyond them. But
Okay.
they do essentially have a missionary zeal. I mean, if given the chance, they would be maximalists. They would take over Constantinople. They tried to, in centuries past. For them, Eastern Europe was saved by them from the Ottomans, and they feel like all those people should be grateful. The thing that needs to be said is that the Russians have never really provided. I mean, if you compare Russia and the West, for example, Russia and the US, and their colonial histories, one thing you can say is that, however, um, sporadically or intermittently, the West has actually delivered development, stability, attempts at democracy to a lot of the places where it was uh, imperial. Um, the Russians have never succeeded in delivering happiness to any place they occupied. Um, Almost all those places, given the chance, would have voted with their feet, kicked the Russians out, and said, "Thank goodness this is over," and indeed did um, when the Soviet Union collapsed.
But
And
this
no,
is why we have to understand the other's perspective, because we might, if you're at the Oxford Debating Society, you might argue for a kind of Benthamite utilitarian uh, attitude where, like, most people, the more happy the more people are, the better off you're doing. I don't think Putin sees the world in that way at all. There's this kind of, well, first of all, I think his own interests are paramount. There's a very selfish utilitarian argument there. But the argument that I think Russians would make to themselves and to those in the near abroad would be, this is your soul, this is your family, this is your blood, this is your land, this is how you are destined to be, and you should embrace it, right?
yeah, good for you. That's exactly right. I think we're talking about a spiritual indoctrination, even for people that are beyond the zone of Russian Orthodoxy. It's like we hold these things sacred, as you say, land, fraternity, um, the sky, the feelings, the Russian poets,
The
the feeling,
soul.
the soul, um, and you should hold these things sacred too. Um, we share a history. Okay, fair enough. We impose that history on you, but we share it, and they never admit that they imposed it. What
Hmm.
they look at it as is they saved you from something. So the idea is that they saved you from, nowadays it's they saved you from the decadence of the West, from gender confusion, from I don't know, drugs and anti-family, and also the loss of national identity. And unfortunately, a lot of these things, they have a point in a lot of. It appeals to a lot of people. That's why they're able to get one populist authoritarian after another into power in countries abroad, who then become pro-Russian, and they help them. They provide them with money and so on. The reason is that a lot of those countries, any country, is full of conservative people who are worried about this stuff.
Yeah.
Um, so their appeal is in that way very insidious.
Yeah.
Even a country like Georgia that was invaded by the Russians, if you appeal on that basis, that the Americans will import homosexuality and gender confusion into your population, you get a lot of very instant reaction from that. And what the Russians say is, we are saving you from that. That's their point. They're not imperial. They are helping. They're salvationists.
So if this is your worldview, and you see these periodic expansions and contractions, and when your empire is contracting, you're losing the fringes, you're losing even the near abroad, you might even lose chunks of what you thought was part of your country itself. You feel increasingly threatened. You lose Estonia, that's bad. You lose Belarus or Ukraine. These are really these are countries that really lie at the core of Russian identity. Which is that right?
Yeah, and I think um, by positing and distributing, disseminating the notion, the evil of what the alternative is, it isn't just a matter of reclaiming what's yours. It's also a matter of saving these people from this horror, which is, for example, American values. Um, and the thing that we must emphasize here is that Putin does not believe in people knowing their own mind. This is a leftover from the Soviet ideology. he believes that people can be corrupted and made to act against their own interests democratically, vote for the wrong thing, because they've been corrupted by America and the West and what have you. And that you do not trust a democratic, a natural democratic electoral outcome or impulse. A whole country can be deluded. And
Hmm.
we see that it's possible. We've seen countries vote totally against their interests, um, perhaps not in vast majorities, but sufficiently to put the wrong people out.
I think I would agree with him on that point. I do feel that.
Can I
I,
just finish there? I've left it a little bit dangling. I don't want any confusion about it.
sure.
We have that same problem, I guess, in the West of countries voting in the wrong direction. But because we have rule of law and we get a second chance and a third chance, we can correct our direction. The Russian attitude is that if you're going to make such a mistake, you don't deserve the right to vote again. You deserve the right to be um, to have a kind of paternalistic control over your decisions, and that's Putin's attitude essentially.
There is a sort of symmetry here, though, where the whole we have these two conflicting alternatives to the general system of governance that can flip from one to the other, and we've seen it in the course of the last 100 years. Countries can flip back and forth, much like when you look at one of these um, visual illusions where it looks like an old woman and then you look at it again and it looks like a young woman. uh, you can look at it, you can only see one or the other. And a society can be democratic, embrace democratic values and the free market and rule of law, then elect somebody like Adolf Hitler or Donald Trump
Right.
who flips it to the other way and then uses his democratically obtained power to corrupt the system, corrupt the courts, seize power. And this is what has happened in Georgia.
That's right. What's happened in Georgia is that the country's richest man, whose money largely derived from Russia, has become a kind of eminence grise there, where he controls and funds the political system, and ultimately there is no freedom of choice. He allows just enough. It's what's called a managed democracy. Um, it's a sort of overmanaged end of the scale, but it's a managed democracy in the sense that the wrong outcome never happens for the people in charge. And he's in charge in the sense that he just bribes everybody, he corrupts the institutions. There's no independent judiciary, there's no independent police. There is a opposition party. And one of the reasons why that opposition party exists is that it gets NGO funding from the West. Its media is funded by help from the West, because opposition people are not allowed to have enough money to be politically independent or politically threatening to the prevailing power in a place like Georgia.
So we
And
just had this massive, there have just been massive demonstrations in Georgia on the streets of Tbilisi in response to the parliament of Georgia passing laws that would essentially prevent the opposition from getting money from the West.
so right now what's happening is that I think because of the war in Ukraine, the Georgians and the Ukrainians have been very, very fraternal over the years because both have been invaded by Moscow. So because of what's happening in Ukraine, the Georgians are beginning to, I think they've come to the point where they might, in one way or another, vote this guy out, even though he controls all the levers of democracy. The eminence grise of Georgia, Bidzina Ivanishvili, realizes that his days are numbered. There's a national election in October. He hasn't been sympathetic enough to Ukraine. He prevented Zelensky from addressing parliament, or at least his minions did. And I think the rest of the country has had enough with his party ruling. So what the party then did is that they decided to try to get rid of the connections to the West that the opposition has. All
So they
right.
have an election coming up, and he's worried that even though he controls all levers of power, the popular will against him might be so overwhelming that he loses anyway.
What this guy, the eminence grise of Georgia, realizes is that in the next national election in October, he will be voted out. So he has to do something essentially to cut off Western voices coming into Georgia. He has to cut off the pro-Western connection in Georgia, and that's why he sponsored this new law.
Now, as we're talking about this civilizational struggle, essentially, I'm called to mind the game of Go, where you have these pieces and one side is black and one side is white, and both players are trying to turn over the other person's pieces to their own color. And in the case of Eastern Europe, we see these pieces flipping back and forth. And we have particularly some countries are pretty solidly pro-West. I think I would put maybe Poland in that category. And then you have places that are pretty much at this point pretty solidly in Russia's camp. Belarus is pretty solid, although it had its moment of wavering where the peoples tried to get rid of the pro-Russian leader, but they were thwarted. But now we have these countries. So what we're seeing in Georgia right now is the battle is being waged, as it were. It will flip this way or it will flip that way. We're having massive outpourings of people onto the street. We're seeing massive repression in an attempt to thwart them, which takes us back to 2014, really 2013 in Ukraine, where where this process was being played out in that context, where there was an election. As I understand it, the pro-Russian candidate won, but then was essentially driven out. Is that right?
Yeah. So Yanushchenko, who was the pro-Russian candidate from the eastern, rotting, industrialized part of Ukraine at the time, which was sympathetic to some degree to Russia, partly sympathetic to Russia because in the Russian era, that was a huge industrial zone, a huge zone of employment, which its products were no longer wanted. The factories were out of date. And so there was a lot of discontent with Ukraine. Russia did its best to spike that discontent. What it would do is cut off oil in the winter, depending on whether the elected Ukrainian president was acting pro-Russian enough or not. So what they got was a kind of a feeling of PTSD and abuse, that Russia, if you offended the Great Bear, you were going to be mistreated. So they tried a pro-Russian president, but sort of on the conditions that he would continue the European arc of narrative for Ukraine, broadly speaking.
So Ukrainian democratically elected you might say, mildly pro-Russian leader. They believed.
Exactly. But he was never that articulately overly pro-Russian. Just as the guy in Georgia has never been overly pro-Russian. It's more about identifying all the flaws of the pro-Western leaders in your own country and the West itself, and blaming the West for all the shortcomings, and preparing constantly a kind of psychological condition for looking at least neutrally at Russian influence. And what happened ultimately is a moment came when Putin said to him, okay, it's time to fish or cut bait. And he had so much pressure on him that he had to make decisions that were perfectly clearly anti-European, anti-Western, and pro-Russian. And I wrote a lot about this in my Forbes column at the time. And what happened is that the public said, no, we didn't elect you to go in that direction. So you began to have lots of demonstrations, in particular in Kiev, in the Maidan. And he, at a certain point, decided I think, with provocation and advice from Russia, they even sent in advisors to him, that it was time for him to just wipe these people out, obliterate the protests. And so they started shooting at people.
Snipers on the roof.
Snipers on the roof and what have you, which is obviously what Putin would have done in Russia. He didn't realize that Ukraine was a completely different kettle of fish. And so he ended up with an even bigger rebellion. And ultimately, the president of Ukraine had to leave.
He
And
fled,
he fled.
tails between his legs.
He flew off to Moscow. Now, a lot of pro-Moscow thinkers, pro-Moscow propagandists, saw this as an illegal revolution, a coup, in effect. And a lot of them like to blame the Americans for it. But the truth is that the real coup began with Yanukovych moving in a direction he had never said he would. In fact, that he'd pledged he wouldn't, which is an anti-European direction. And that's the thing that was the beginning of the coup. And it was forced on him by Russia.
But did Russia feel, and Putin in particular, that moving towards Europe was simply unacceptable for a country that lay so close to the heart of the Russian empire and identity?
I think so. I think he never believed that Ukraine was an independent country. He felt it was like a lost limb.
Right.
And the fact that people on the whole there didn't think that was no problem for him. It doesn't have the inbuilt idea that we do, that if somebody thinks in a certain way, they have a right to that belief. He just thinks, okay, they're all delusional. The only way to correct this is to kick their butts, to propagandize them intensively first, and then to go in there and be kind of fraternally invasive, and ultimately do it by a series of, in other words, it's sort of like an abused partner. They go in and they show a lot of friendliness while pointing their tanks at you. I mean,
Right.
I interviewed a tank commander in Georgia when the Russians invaded. And I said, don't you think this is abusive to Georgians that you're here with your tank? And he said, no, you don't understand. He was drunk. They were all the Russian soldiers were drunk all the time. He said, no, you don't understand. We are brothers with Georgians, and we're just protecting them from evil influences. They want us here. Sometimes they get distracted, but they really want us here. So that's their attitude to Ukraine also, that Ukraine is actually a Russian, part of Russia. Of course, it's been made more Russian over the centuries by various genocidal acts spurred by Moscow. So, for example, in Crimea, all the Crimeans were moved right out of there. The place in Donbass, a lot of people died during the famines in the 20s. And so the Russians just sent a whole load of Russians there.
Yeah.
So the population changes are very deliberately imperial. So it's
Yes.
really ingenuous for people to say, oh, it's a pro-Russian thing, Well, in the first place, no, it's not. Those people really don't want to be part of Russia. And secondly, yeah, you've implanted your ethnic population there.
Right.
That's because of genocide.
Yeah. Melik, I want to you're so knowledgeable on this topic, and your nuances are so fine that we've taken a lot of time to get to where we are, which is 2014. After the Maidan rebellion, Ukraine finds itself essentially much like the United States did. You could sort of draw the United States after it broke free from Britain, kind of saying, "Oh my gosh, now we're alone in the world. What do we do?" Simultaneously under attack in the case of Ukraine, and Russia seems to have been provoked, from its perspective, provoked into a new posture vis-a-vis the West. To my mind, I see a whole string of aggressive moves that take place on the fields of espionage, propaganda, misinformation, what has come to be called hybrid warfare. And I think that given that we've been talking for almost an hour now, it's probably beyond the scope of the present conversation. I would love to bring you back to talk about some of these things, because we started out by trying to talk about your latest Forbes article, which had to do with Ukraine being allowed to use its weapons on Russian territory. Um, but the question I want to wrap up with today, in hopes of bringing you back to talk about the follow-ups, what occurred in the years that followed, was, did this breakaway by Ukraine, in the context of Russia and Putin struggling to contain and reverse the centrifugal forces pulling the empire apart, pulling parts of it towards the West or towards more independent ways of thinking. Was there something that was different about Ukraine that provoked a disproportionately large and vigorous Russian response that essentially put it on a collision course with the West that we're now experiencing, that we're still experiencing today?
Well, I think first of all, of the post-Soviet countries around the perimeter of what became the the Russian Federation, Ukraine was the largest. It was probably the most pro-European, the most contact with Europe
Mm-hmm.
over the widest perimeter. It was also felt to be by Russians, certainly by the Russian elite, a place where they could enact their power moves easily. They felt they had enough sympathetic people sympathetic to Russia in Ukraine, that the Russian model of oligarchic rule or oligarchic power could be sustained. The whole idea, I think, with the Russians is to put somebody in place who's an authoritarian populist, give him a heck of a lot of money, have him dismantle the rule of law and the Western processes of state, and have him just sit there. And you see examples of that. Georgia is an example of that. Hungary is an example of that. After a certain point, elections are not free and fair. They're corrupted. And this guy, whoever is in charge in these countries, just keeps the thing going in a shambolic way. And you never again hear what the will of the people might be. And that's really what they intended for Ukraine. They'd done that. They did it with Lukashenko in Belarus over the years. They've managed to do that. They have people in Eastern Europe who've managed, like Hungary, and Georgia. They have also. That's really their ideal. In Central Asian countries, they managed to do that. What the color revolutions did was get rid of that phase of people in the 2000s. Then, in the immediate post-Soviet period, Moscow had installed a lot of these authoritarian people in place who to pretend to be independent, but still do everything through Moscow. The color revolutions in the 2000s came along, threw all those people out. Then Moscow began to either invade or sanction or bully these countries, so that ultimately the countries gave in. And then you managed to put people in there who were pro-Russian. And then you had, in effect, a second wave of color revolution. And that's what the Maidan Revolution was about. It was
Right.
about getting rid of another wave of kind of post-Soviet elected authoritarian leaders who would then shift everything towards Moscow, and elections and democracy and so on would then disappear. And the Maidan people decided we're not going to allow that to happen.
Did something happen in 2014 that shifted Russia's strategic posture from one that was essentially defensive, trying to prevent these countries from slipping into a pro-Western democracy, to one that became more offensive, trying to take the fight, as it were, into the enemy heartland?
What sort of thing are you thinking?
I'm thinking about the Skripal poisonings, tampering with elections around the world.
But what sort of thing are you thinking of that might have triggered that might have changed the Russian?
Well, I wonder if because Ukraine was such a red line for Putin, if it represented such an unacceptable breach, if from Putin's perspective, the Maidan really was a US engineered coup d'etat that required an eye for an eye, that we have to take the fight. We can no longer just try to fight fires that are being lit around our house by the enemy. We have to light fires in the enemy's house.
Well, remember, he had started to do that anyway. I mean, he started with the invasion of Georgia in 2008. He felt that.
Yeah, but Georgia was part of the former Soviet Union, whereas if you're poisoning, throwing people out of windows in places like London or Salisbury, or tampering with elections in many Western countries, do you see what I'm saying? It's like seems to be a category, a different category from merely replacing.
Oh, I see. So you're saying post-Maidan, he began to take a much, much more globally aggressive, full court press kind of attitude to points abroad.
That's my thesis. I mean, that's essentially my thesis.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I think also, I mean, if you want to look at it sectionally, phase by phase, essentially he never recovered from seeing the Libyan dictator Gaddafi being dragged on the streets and dismembered and so on, and realized, I think, that sooner or later it would happen to him, because he was that Putin himself was destined for that, because the West wouldn't respect deals made, tacit or secret deals made with him, in the way that they didn't respect it from his perspective with Gaddafi, and that Putin would end up like that. So immediately at that moment he decided, okay, I have to be defensive against the West. Then there was a phase in which the West was involved very deeply, and the US was involved very deeply with the war on terror, and that allowed Putin enough distraction on America's part to regain bits of its empire. Then there was the Maidan revolution, and in Ukraine, and he decided that his reimposing of post-Soviet type of leaders on countries would not last, would not hold, because of endless Western pressure and democratic pressure and pro-Western habits, and the EU gradually influencing everybody against Russia and so on, that he decided he had to do a proactive
You have to
attitude
take the fight to the West.
to the West. So that's when you began to see poisonings and so on happening, and execution of dissidents and what have you. But you had that already. It's just it wasn't done as systematically.
The first time we started to talk about this many years ago, you said something that has really stuck with me, and I wonder if you still feel this. You said that for someone in Putin's shoes, the worst nightmare is for his people, his subjects, to wake up and look across the way and see people just like them who have freedom, who have economic prosperity, who have choices, and say, I want that too.
Yeah, and that is, you're absolutely right. that is his biggest nightmare, and the way he prevents that is not immediately by overthrowing the leadership there, regime change, which is what he ultimately did, which is what he did in Georgia, what he did in Ukraine bit by bit, and is now trying to do it aggressively with the use of war in Ukraine. What he begins with is to make the life of those people across the way more miserable, so that his own people don't look across the way and say, his own population doesn't look across the border and say, those people are doing better than us financially, they're having a better time than us, they have access to better goods and services and luxuries and what have you, and they're free. Therefore, we don't like Putin in charge because we're not getting any of that. So he prevents that realization by making life miserable across the border. And he kept doing that to the Ukrainians. He kept doing that to the Georgians. He would sanction them. He'd cut off oil. They'd have miserable cold winters. He'd arrange it so that they'd have collapses in their currency and so on. So that's his first reaction to that feeling, to the fear of his own people beginning to be envious of a nearby country, is make that country more miserable first.
And he's had a remarkable run of success uh, in many countries. We can point to places like Brazil, Turkey, Hungary, many places around the world. In some places that success is held, in some places it hasn't. It's a seesaw, it's a battle, and I want to talk to you more about that. I want to pause for now. Your expertise and the subtlety of your insight is so very valuable
Thank you
that
for
it,
your kind words.
well, I really mean it, and I really encourage people to look for Melik's writing. We'll put, as I said, links in the show notes, and look for his work in Forbes going forward. He has a lot to say, and it's really important. It
The Wall
requires,
Street Journal and the Wall Street Journal. Let's
and the Wall Street Journal. My apologies.
yeah.
Anywhere he's published, Forbes and the
Mm.
Wall Street Journal. But Melik, I want to, for now, thank you for taking the time. I want to come back to you in future episodes to talk about some of the consequences that followed, because it's all very important and really urgent. This is one of the reasons why I feel very passionately about this subject, because it affects all of us and it affects the world. There is a battle, there is a game of Go, and the pieces are flipping black to white, white to black, and it really matters to all of us which way ultimately prevails. And I think one way will ultimately prevail if we get our act together. Um,
Yes.
but Melik, thank you again,
Thank you.
and I
Lovely to
look
talk.
forward to talking to you soon.
Okay. Fabulous. Talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thanks again to Melik. This episode has gone a little long. I just want to do a quick community radar. There's been some really interesting stuff coming in, and I want to respond to it as much as I can. This one is about Zahari's flight simulator. You'll remember that last episode, we got into a Cat D simulator to see what would happen if we isolated the left AC bus or the entire electrical system. And the question arose after the show, well, is there any evidence that Zahari did something like this on his flight simulator? You'll recall that the Malaysian authorities recovered from his home, from his flight simulator, a hard drive that showed that a month before the plane disappeared, he had conducted a flight that bore an uncanny similarity to what actually seems, or the authorities thought had happened. He flew up the Malacca Strait and then put the plane down deep in the southern Indian Ocean and set the fuel to zero. And this was such an uncanny parallel to what they deduced happened from the Inmarsat data that to many people this is a smoking gun. So, but there's an unusual aspect to it, which is that if you were going to use your home flight simulator to plan out an epic murder suicide, you might expect that you would use it to do the things that were most difficult, that were most unusual, that you yourself had never done. In this case, that flight simulator from his basement, those data did not show that he went towards Beijing and did a 180, that it flew over an Air Force base at Butterworth, as happened in real life. And so the question is, was there anything on the flight simulator that would suggest that Zahari practiced isolating some or all of the plane's electrical system? Or before even that question arises, is it even possible to do that on the kind of flight simulator that Zahari had? Okay, that was the question. And viewer Mike Collins stepped forward. Mike has a lot of experience with flight simulators. He has reached out to me in the past. And I put the question to him, Mike, given what you know about this flight simulator software, first of all, can you isolate the left AC bus? Mike came back. The answer was yes, you can. He sent me a picture of what it looks like. You indeed get the same kind of electrical alerts that you would see in the full CAT-D simulator. So that seems to be very realistic. Part B of the question was, okay, does that show up in the kind of data that was retrieved by the authorities from Zahari's hard drive? Unfortunately, the answer here is it doesn't. So you can't really tell, based on the data that was retrieved, whether Zahari did this kind of electrical isolation or not. I have to say, if more data comes forward, if Zahari isolated some or all of his electrical system on the flight simulator in his basement, that would be extremely damning for Zahari. At this point, we just don't know. But it's an interesting question. And Mike, thank you. A lot of times we ask questions, we try to get the answers, and either we just can't find any answers or the answers turn out not to be dispositive. It doesn't mean it was a failure. We just have to keep knocking on that door, trying to get in. So anyway, that's all I have for you today. This has been episode 3, season 2, Deep Dive MH370. Thank you for watching. Last time I'm going to say this in this episode. If you value this podcast, if you want to help out, please subscribe, like. If you want to get a weekly newsletter about it, check out deepdivemh370.com. And if you really want to support us, you can buy a subscription, which helps out even more. So thank you for watching. Thank you for helping out. Don't stop looking and don't stop asking hard questions. See you next time.